3 knocks. The sound echoed through the warehouse. Deep, hollow, deliberate. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an accident. Someone was here. Usher's body tensed, his instincts screaming at him to run. But Jungkook? Jungkook stood still. His jaw clenched, his muscles tight, his breathing measured, like he had been expecting this. Jungkook. Usher's voice came out hoarse. Shoo. Jungkook didn't take his eyes off the darkness beyond the doorway. Another knock. This time closer. Usher's pulse hammered against his ribs. His skin felt cold, a thin sheen of sweat forming at his temples. His mind screamed at him to make sense of this. Who were they? What did they want? But the truth was clawing its way back into his memory, and it was worse than he could have imagined. Because deep down he already knew, and that meant it was too late. The light above them flickered wildly. The air in the warehouse shifted thicker, heavier, suffocating. Jungkook took a slow step back, his voice low and urgent. We can't stay here. Usher barely had time to react before. Bang! The door slammed shut behind them. The warehouse plunged into darkness. For a second, there was nothing. No sound. No light. No movement. Then, Usher. A whisper. Cold, crawling along the back of his skull. Not Jungkook's voice. Someone else. Someone he had forgotten. His breath hitched. His chest tightened. A sharp pain slicing through his ribs. Then the darkness cracked, and he was no longer in the warehouse. The recording booth was dimly lit, the soundproof walls swallowing every noise. Usher sat at the mixing desk, headphones over his ears, listening to the playback of their final take. Jungkook was beside him, humming along to the melody. The track was perfect. Every note, every harmony, seamless. This is it, Usher had said, grinning. This is the one. Jungkook had smirked, nodding in agreement. Told you. They didn't know it then. Didn't know it would be the last time they ever heard it. Didn't know that something was listening, too. 3 knocks. They both froze. Jungkook pulled off his headphones. Was that? Another knock. This time it wasn't on the door. Came from inside the studio. Usher's throat went dry. He turned his head slowly, eyes scanning the room. Nothing. No one. But the air felt wrong. Jungkook was already standing, his entire body tense. Who's there? No answer. Then, the computer screen glitched. A burst of static filled their headphones. The audio file, their track, began playing on its own. Distorted. Warped. Changed. Usher's stomach dropped. It wasn't just their voices anymore. Something else was singing. Something inside the track. Shut it off. Jungkook had shouted. Usher's hands flew to the keyboard, trying to stop it, but the controls wouldn't respond. And then, over the corrupted audio, buried deep beneath the distortion, a whisper. You should not have made this. And then darkness. Usher gasped as he was yanked back into reality. His knees buckled. His head pounded. His vision swam. Jungkook caught him before he collapsed. Breathe. Beate, Mann. Usher sucked in a sharp breath, his pulse erratic. I remember. Jungkook's jaw tightened. Yeah, I figured. Usher's mind raced, the pieces finally clicking into place. They erased our memories. No, Jungkook said, voice low. They didn't erase them. They hid them, buried them. Until now. Usher wiped a trembling hand over his face. The song. It wasn't just a song. Was it? Jungkook's expression darkened. No. Silence. Then, from the shadows, a voice. You finally remember. Both of them turned sharply. The man in black stood at the far end of the warehouse. Motionless. Silent. The symbol on his wrist glowed faintly in the dark. And he wasn't alone. More figures emerged from the shadows, one by one. Too many. Surrounding them. Trapping them. Jungkook's fists clenched. We need to go. Now. Usher's heartbeat roared in his ears. The memories were back. And the ones who had buried them? They had come to collect. The figures closed in. Usher could hear his own pulse pounding, his breath ragged. The dim warehouse light flickered, casting eerie shadows over their motionless forms. The man in black stood at the center, the symbol on his wrist pulsing like a heartbeat. Jungkook shifted beside him, his stance tight. Ready. If we run, they'll follow, Usher muttered under his breath. If we stay, we die. Jungkook didn't take his eyes off them. Your choice. A beat. Then, the figures moved. Not rushed. Not panicked. Deliberate. Like they had all the time in the world. Usher's scoot twisted. He had been chased before, by the press, by obsessed fans, by industry execs who wanted more than he was willing to give. But this was different. Now, Jungkook's voice snapped him back. Before Usher could think, Jungkook grabbed his arm and ran. The warehouse exploded into movement. They sprinted toward the nearest exit, boots slamming against the concrete floor. One of the figures reached for them. Usher saw it out of the corner of his eye. A hand, pale and unnatural, stretching toward him. The symbol on the wrist flared blindingly bright. And then, the world warped. The air around them rippled, like heat rising from asphalt. Usher's body locked up. His legs refused to move. His vision blurred. The warehouse was gone. The figures were gone. Jungkook was gone. He was somewhere else. Somewhere he shouldn't be. The first thing Usher noticed was the silence. Thick, heavy, absolute. No echoes. No distant hum of the city. No breath of wind. Just nothing. He turned. A room. Familiar. But wrong. It was the studio, the same one from Seoul 3 years ago. But something was off. The lights were too dim. The walls seemed softer, almost pulsing, like a living thing. The mixing desk was still there, the soundboard untouched. And at the center, the computer screen was on. File was open. Track 0. Usher's stomach dropped. No. His voice came out hoarse. This wasn't real. Couldn't be real. He had buried this place. They had buried it. A whisper drifted through the air. Play it. Usher's blood ran cold. He knew that voice. It wasn't Jungkook. It wasn't anyone he recognized. But he knew it. Deep in his bones. Like it had been waiting for him. Like it had been part of him all along. His hand trembled as he reached for the mouse. The cursor hovered over the file. Track 0. The song they had never finished. The song they had never released. The song that shouldn't exist. He clicked. And the speakers came to life. At first, there was nothing but static. Then, a single drawn-out note. Low. Resonant. Wrong. It curled around the room, slithering into his ears, sinking into his skull. And then, the voice. Not his. Not Jungkook's. Something else. I see you. Usher's breath caught. His fingers clenched the edge of the desk. His mind screamed at him to stop, to shut it off, destroy it, burn the entire studio to the ground. But he couldn't move. The voice wasn't singing. It was speaking. Directly to him. You should not have come back. The lights in the room flickered violently. The walls seemed to breathe. And then, 3 knocks. Usher's chest seized. He turned. The man in black stood in the doorway. No, not stood. He was floating. His feet hovered inches above the ground. His eyes were missing. Only darkness remained. And then, he smiled. A hand grabbed Usher's wrist. He jerked violently. Suddenly, the warehouse, Jungkook, the cold night air, the dim, flickering streetlights. Usher's body shook violently. His skin was clammy. His lungs burned. He was back. Usher. Jungkook's voice cut through the haze. Usher gasped like he had been drowning. His mind was spinning, nausea rolling in his gut. He grabbed onto Jungkook's sleeve, grounding himself. Jungkook's face was pale, eyes sharp with concern. What the hell just happened? Usher opened his mouth. But the moment he did, his throat tightened. Like something was choking him from the inside. Like he wasn't allowed to speak. His hands flew to his neck, panic setting in. Jungkook grabbed his shoulders. Breathe. Focus. What did you see? Usher squeezed his eyes shut. The voice. The track. The man in black. Slowly his breathing evened out. The grip on his throat eased. And finally he forced out the words. The track isn't gone. Jungkook's expression darkened. It's still out there. A long silence. Then, Jungkook's voice, barely above a whisper. Then we're screwed. Because if the track was still out there, it meant the ones who buried it had never left. And now they wanted him back. The car tore through the empty streets, the engine growling like a caged beast. Jungkook's hands were tight on the wheel, his knuckles white. Usher sat in the passenger seat, his breath still uneven. Neither of them had spoken since the warehouse. The city passed in a blur, streetlights casting long, shifting shadows over their faces. The silence inside the car was thick, not from comfort, but from the weight of something unseen, something watching. Where are we going? Usher finally forced out, his voice rough. Somewhere they can't follow. Usher turned his head, studying Jungkook's expression. It was set like stone, jaw clenched, eyes locked on the road ahead. You've done this before. Jungkook didn't answer immediately. Then, yeah. A chill crawled down Usher's spine. And you didn't tell me? Jungkook exhaled through his nose. Would you have believed me? Usher opened his mouth, then closed it. No, because 3 years ago he hadn't. And now it was too late. They pulled into a deserted alleyway near the East River. The building was old, rusted fire escapes, boarded up windows. The kind of place where people vanished. Jungkook killed the engine. Stay close. They stepped out, boots crunching against wet pavement. The air smelled of metal and salt water, thick with the weight of something unnatural. Jungkook led them through a side entrance, up a narrow flight of stairs. At the top, he punched in a code on a keypad. The lock clicked, and the door swung open. Inside was, surprisingly normal.
À Dimlili appartement.
Books stacked in uneven piles. A cluttered desk with multiple monitors. Screens filled with lines of code. A worn leather couch. An unmade bed in the corner. A safe house. Jungkook locked the door behind them. This is where you've been hiding? Usher asked, scanning the room. Jungkook tossed his jacket onto a chair.
No.
This is where I've been waiting. Usher frowned. For what? Jungkook's gaze was unreadable. For you to wake up. Usher dropped onto the couch, rubbing his face. His head still pounded, fragments of track 0 slithering through his brain. Start talking. Jungkook leaned against the desk, arms crossed. 3 years ago, he began. When we made the track, something happened. You don't remember all of it yet, but I do. I always have. Usher stiffened. They never erased your memory completely. They just buried it. But me, they left me awake. The air thinned. Usher looked up. Why? Jungkook's fingers tensed over his biceps. Because I'm the one who opened the door. The words hit like a gut punch. What do you mean? Jungkook exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. He reached for his laptop and pulled up a file. Track 0. Usher's breath hitched. No, he whispered. That's not possible. Jungkook clicked play. The same distorted melody crawled into the room. The low, drawn-out note. The resonance of something unnatural. But then, a second voice. Not the whisper from before. A child. Singing softly. Usher's skin prickled. The voice was too familiar. Too much like his own. His hands trembled as he looked at Jungkook. What is this? Jungkook's eyes darkened. The part of the song that only you can hear. Usher shot up from the couch. His pulse thundered in his ears. That's not, no. That can't be real. Jungkook met his gaze, steady and unwavering. You still don't get it, do you? He pushed away from the desk, stepping closer. The song, this track, it's not just music. It's not just something we recorded in a studio. It's something older. Something that's been waiting. For what? Jungkook's voice was barely above a whisper. For you. The air crackled between them. Usher's hands clenched into fists. His breath came in sharp bursts. He wanted to deny it. Wanted to burn the whole thing down. But deep inside, he knew. He had always known. Then, the lights flickered. A low hum filled the air. Jungkook's head snapped toward the door. Usher's chest seized. They weren't alone. 3 soft knocks rattled through the apartment. Usher and Jungkook froze. Then, a voice. Open the door, Usher. Usher's blood turned to ice. The voice was his own. Jungkook's breath hitched. He moved slowly, hand reaching for something under the desk. A gun. Usher's pulse thundered. His vision blurred. The knocks came again. Harder. Faster. You have to remember, Usher. The walls shuddered. The air warped. And then, the door burst open. A figure stood in the doorway. Not the man in black. Not one of the faceless ones from the warehouse. It was Usher. But not him. His eyes were missing. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. Then, a whisper slithered through the air. Time's up. The room exploded into darkness. Blackness. Thick. Unrelenting. A void that swallowed everything. Usher couldn't move. His body felt weightless, as if he had been unmoored from reality itself. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of something old, dust and decay, like the inside of a tomb. Then, a whisper. It's time to wake up. A hand gripped his wrist, cold, strong, familiar. Usher's body jerked violently. Light exploded into his vision. And suddenly, he was somewhere else. His chest rose and fell in rapid gasps as his vision adjusted. He was standing in a hallway. Narrow.
Dim Lily.
The wallpaper was faded, peeling at the corners. The floorboards beneath his feet groaned softly, like they were tired of holding weight. Usher knew this place. A house he had long forgotten. Or rather, a house that had been taken from his memory. His pulse hammered as he took a hesitant step forward. The walls breathed. The air shuddered. And at the end of the hall, a door, slightly ajar. Beyond it, darkness. Then, a voice. His own. Usher. The hair on the back of his neck rose. He turned, and there he was. The other Usher. Standing in the shadows, watching him. His eyes were black voids. His lips curved into a smile. But his expression was wrong. Too stretched, too wide, like skin pulled too tight over a skull. You left me here. Usher's body went rigid. No, he whispered. The other Usher tilted his head. The movement was jerky, unnatural, like a broken marionette. You left me behind. But I never left you. The walls shuddered violently. The floor split open beneath his feet. And Usher was falling. A sharp, agonizing pain in his chest. Then, cold, real. Usher's eyes snapped open. He was back. The safe house. The broken down apartment. The dim light from the monitors casting long shadows across the room. Jungkook was beside him, gripping his shoulders. Usher. His vision swam, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His head felt like it had been ripped apart and stitched back together wrong. What the hell just happened? Jungkook's voice was sharp, controlled, but his eyes were tense. Usher swallowed hard. I saw it, he rasped. The door. Jungkook's expression darkened. The house, Usher continued, his voice unsteady. The one from my childhood. It was real. It was. He ran a hand through his damp hair, trying to steady himself. It's where the song came from. Jungkook's breath caught. What? Usher locked eyes with him. The song. Track 0. It didn't start in the studio. He exhaled shakily. It started there. In that house. Silence. Jungkook clenched his jaw, dragging a hand down his face. Then we have a bigger problem than I thought. The truth buried in sound. Jungkook stood, moving swiftly to his desk. He typed something into the keyboard, pulling up the track. Usher's stomach twisted. The screen displayed the sound wave of track 0. But something was wrong. The frequencies weren't normal. Beneath the visible spectrum, buried in the layers of sound, there was something else. Look at this, Jungkook muttered. He adjusted the settings, isolating a deeper layer of the recording. The visual representation of the track shifted. Pattern emerged. Usher's breath caught.
No.
Because it wasn't random. It was a map. Jungkook stilled. What the hell? The image sharpened. The map showed a single location. A town. buried deep in a rural part of Tennessee. Usher's hands clenched into fists. That's where the house is. Jungkook turned to face him, his expression unreadable. Then that's where we have to go. The road to the unseen. They packed fast. Minimal supplies, just enough for one night. Jungkook loaded a gun. Usher didn't ask where he got it. He already knew. The drive was long. Hours passed in tense silence. The city lights faded behind them, swallowed by the endless stretch of black highway. Usher's mind churned. The other Usher. The house. The door. And the thing that had whispered to him through the track. You left me behind. His throat tightened. Had he really forgotten? Or had something been taken from him? Beside him, Jungkook adjusted his grip on the wheel. Whatever happens, he said, voice steady. We end this. Usher swallowed hard, staring out into the night. But deep down, he wasn't sure they could. Because some things don't stay buried. And the past always finds a way back. The road twisted into a forgotten part of the countryside, where the trees stood too still, their branches clawing at the sky. The headlights of Jungkook's car barely cut through the thick fog that rolled in like smoke, swallowing everything beyond a few feet. Usher gripped the edge of his seat, eyes fixed on the road. This place, he started, voice tight. Feels wrong, Jungkook finished. He didn't need to say it. The air was thicker here, pressing against their chests like unseen hands. The silence beyond the car was absolute. No insects, no wind, not even the rustling of leaves. Like the land itself was holding its breath. Then, the trees opened up, and there it was, the house. Usher's stomach twisted into a cold knot. It looked exactly the same, like time had forgotten it. The faded white paint, the rotting porch, the second-floor window that was always slightly open. Jungkook pulled the car to a stop, killing the engine. Neither of them moved. Neither of them breathed. Then, a soft knock on the car window. From inside the house, Usher's pulse exploded, because the sound hadn't come from outside the car. It had come from the speakers. Someone had knocked. From inside the track. Track 0 was playing on its own, crossing the threshold. We need to get out of here. Jungkook's voice was low, urgent. But Usher was already opening the door. He had to go inside. He had to see. Jungkook cursed under his breath but followed, pulling the gun from his jacket. The second Usher's feet touched the ground, the air changed. The silence deepened. The temperature dropped. The door to the house swung open, on its own. Usher. I know, he muttered. It's waiting for me. And he stepped inside. The house that wasn't empty. The second they crossed the threshold, the air thickened, pressing against their skin like static before a lightning strike. The house smelled of damp wood and dust, but beneath it, something rotten. The walls were lined with old picture frames, faces blurred. I scratched out. Usher's heart pounded as he moved forward. His feet remembered the path before his mind did. Through the narrow hallway, past the old grandfather clock that had never worked, and toward the door. It was waiting for him. The same wooden door from his vision, slightly ajar. Beyond it, darkness. Don't, Jungkook warned. But Usher's hand was already reaching out, fingers grazing the wood. The air shifted, and something whispered his name. Not from inside the room, but from behind them. They spun, and the hallway was gone. Instead, the house stretched endlessly, walls twisting, spiraling inward. The pictures along the walls had changed. They weren't blurred anymore. They were all of Usher, from every year of his life. Except, in every one he was standing in this house. Even the ones from before he had ever been here. Usher's breath turned shallow. This isn't real, Jungkook muttered, stepping closer. It's trying to break your mind. But Usher's gaze was locked on the final picture. It was from tonight, and in it, he was standing alone. Jungkook wasn't in the frame, and his own eyes were missing. The room that never let go. We need to move. Jungkook grabbed Usher's arm, yanking him back toward the door. It wasn't ajar anymore. It was wide open. A deep black void stretched beyond the frame. And then, something stepped out. Not the other usher. Something worse. A shape tall, thin, barely human. The skin rippled, shifting like static. It had no face, just a mouth. A mouth that smiled too wide. And then it spoke. You brought the song back. The walls shook. The house groaned, breathed, laughed. Usher's body locked up. Jungkook raised the gun. Run! The escape that wasn't. They tore down the endless hallway, the walls stretching, bending, trying to keep them inside. The thing behind them laughed, but the sound was distorted, like a song played backward. The front door was gone. A dead end. Jungkook turned, raising the gun. The creature tilted its head. Then, it sang. Not words, not music, just a sound. Low, resonant, wrong. And the bullet never left the gun. The air rippled. Jungkook collapsed. Eyes wide, mouth open, silent. Usher screamed. He grabbed Jungkook, shaking him, yelling. But no sound came out. His voice was gone. The creature stepped closer. You can't run from a song that's already inside you. His hand reached for him. And then, the house shattered. A deafening crack split through the air, like a record scratching. And Usher's vision exploded into white. Somewhere else. When Usher opened his eyes, he was in a hospital. The beeping of machines. The scent of antiseptic. His fingers twitched against cool sheets. Then, a voice. He's awake. His head turned. Jungkook. Alive. Sitting beside his bed. Dark circles under his eyes. Relief hit Usher like a punch to the chest. What? His voice cracked. Jungkook held up a hand. You passed out. I had to drag you out of that place. Usher's pulse pounded. Asterisk the house. Jungkook's face darkened. It's gone. Usher's breath stalled. What do you mean, gone? Jungkook hesitated. I mean it was never there. Cold flooded Usher's veins. Jungkook handed him his phone. Usher's fingers trembled as he scrolled through the GPS history. No record of the town. No record of the road. No house. As if it had never existed. But then, his breath caught. Because there was one file left in his phone. A voice memo. Track 0. And in the background, someone was breathing.